The net room. The invite had called it a transformative circular fashion experience. Priya had read that line on the train from Paddington and written 3 words in her notebook: "Here we go." 32 journalists stood outside a converted Victorian fish market on the Cornish coast, and not one of them had dressed for the wind. The building was beautiful. She would give it that pale stone iron framing, the old market name still carved above the entrance in letters worn soft by 2 centuries of salt air. Someone had put potted kelp either side of the door. Kelp in pots. Priya noted it, filed it under, try hard. The startup was called Network. 2 founders, both women, both under 35. They made luxury textile from recovered ghost fishing nets, the gear abandoned on the ocean floor, the stuff that kept killing long after the boats had gone home. The fabric was being stocked, apparently, by 3 Scandinavian design houses and 1 very serious Italian label whose name Priya recognized from the kind of magazine she read in other people's waiting rooms. The whole operation had the smell of a good press release. She had written the lead in her head before leaving London. Another pretty story about the sea we're killing, dressed up in something you can buy. She was here to find the seams in it. The prince arrived 11 minutes late in a Land Rover that looked like it had actually been used for something. He stepped out in a jacket that was slightly wrong for the occasion, too casual for a royal visit, too considered for genuine casualness, and immediately walked toward the kelp pots instead of the waiting handlers. His security team performed the small collective adjustment that close protection officers do when their principal has gone marginally off route. He crouched down, looked at the kelp, stood back up, said something to the nearest aide that made the aide smile despite themselves. Priya uncapped her pen. Inside, the fish market had been opened up rather than hidden. Whoever had done the conversion had made a decision Priya respected even as she resented it. They had kept the bones. The iron pillars, the old drainage channels in the stone floor, the high clear-story windows that flooded the space with the particular flat gray light of a Cornish November. The smell of fish was gone, but something of the sea had stayed. A mineral undertone, salt pressed into the stone over 100 years until it became structural. The production floor ran along the eastern wall. Actual machines, not decorative ones. Workers in practical clothes doing things that looked like work rather than performance. Priya counted 14 people on the floor at a glance, which was more than she'd expected for what the press materials had called a boutique operation. The founders were waiting at the entrance to the floor. Saoirse Donnelly was tall, red-haired, with the kind of posture that came from years of physical work rather than years of yoga. Mira Pillai was shorter, wore her hair up, and had ink on 2 fingers that she hadn't bothered to clean off before the prince arrived, which Priya found she liked immediately and noted as potentially significant. Both of them shook William's hand the way people shake hands with someone they've decided to treat normally regardless of protocol, firm, brief, no performance. "Welcome," Saoirse said. "We'll show you how it works, stop us whenever." He did stop them, almost immediately. They were 3 minutes into the floor tour, Mira explaining the intake process, the nets arriving filthy, encrusted, tangled, when William pointed at one of the sorting tables and asked why the nets were being sorted by color if they were going to be processed into fiber anyway. Mira paused, looked at the table, looked at him. "They're not sorted by color," she said. "They're sorted by polymer type. Nylon 6, Nylon 6/6, and polyester all have different processing temperatures and different final fiber properties. The color thing is coincidence. It turns out different fishing fleets in different regions tended to use different colored gear, so sorting by polymer ends up looking a bit like sorting by color." William said, "So I'm accidentally right." "In the loosest possible sense," Saoirse said. Something in the room shifted. A few of the other journalists laughed. Priya noticed that the workers on the floor were listening, not performing listening, actually listening, which was the thing that happened when your founders were the kind of people whose staff paid attention to what they said. She wrote, polymer sort/color accident, he's going to keep doing this. He did keep doing this. At the shredding station, he asked if the machines were the same ones used for plastic recycling. They were not, Mira explained. The tension requirements were different. The blade geometry was different. The whole engineering problem was different because you were dealing with salt-saturated fiber under variable tension rather than rigid plastic. And so they had worked with an engineering firm in Falmouth for 14 months to modify existing equipment until it did what they needed. William asked how many times the machines had broken during that 14 months. Mira said, often enough that our chief engineer has a name for each one. He asked what the names were. She told him. They were all named after Cornish weather systems: Mizzle, Har, Squall, and one called Bastard February, which she delivered with the flat precision of someone quoting a formal document. The press pack laughed. William laughed. Priya wrote down Bastard February and drew a small box around it, and then felt slightly annoyed at herself for finding it charming. The tour moved deeper into the building. The net room was at the back, past the processing floor and through a set of double doors that were heavier than they needed to be. The reason became apparent when you stepped through. It was cold in there, deliberately. The temperature kept low to slow any remaining biological activity in the incoming material. The ceiling was high. From it hung the recovered nets in great tangled masses, some clean and ready for processing, some newly arrived and still carrying the ocean with them. Barnacles, rope weed. In one corner, something that might have been a ghost crab had made it all the way to Cornwall, still attached to a mesh of nylon, and been frozen mid-scuttle into a kind of permanent alarm. The room smelled of the deep sea, not the beach deeper than that, the cold, dark kind. The press pack shuffled. A few people photographed the crab. William stood in the middle of the room and looked up at the nets the way you looked at something that took a moment to resolve into what it actually was. Saoirse said, "This is where it starts." She talked about ghost gear without drama, which was more effective than drama would have been. 240,000 tons of fishing gear lost or abandoned in the ocean every year. Still fishing. Nobody's net, killing everybody's sea. The nets lasted centuries. They photo-degraded into microplastics, but they never stopped catching fish, turtles, dolphins, seabirds, each one becoming bait for the next, the gear turning itself into an engine of accumulation at the bottom of the ocean floor. She talked about recovery, the divers, the cost, the logistical nightmare of bringing material up from depth without it disintegrating, the partnerships with fishing communities in Norway and the Azores and Cornwall itself. Then she said something she said without any particular emphasis, as if it were simply part of the factual sequence. My father's boat left gear behind, not from carelessness, from the math of it. The fine for reporting lost gear was more than the net was worth, so you didn't report it. You hoped it sank deep enough to stop fishing. It didn't. William, who had been looking at the nets, looked at her. She was not inviting sympathy. Her voice had the flatness of someone who has said a true thing so many times it has worn smooth. Her father had fished out of Newlyn. He had left gear behind because the system had made reporting it more expensive than silence. He had known what that meant and done it anyway because the alternative was not eating. She was not excusing it. She was not condemning it. She was stating the precise terms of an impossible situation that a lot of men in a lot of ports had faced and resolved the same way. The regulation was right, she said. The support wasn't there, so we got the worst of both. The room was quiet except for the refrigeration hum. Priya had stopped writing. She looked at William. He was looking at Saoirse with an expression that was hard to categorize, not pity, not the careful sympathy of a man who has been trained to express careful sympathy. Something more like the face a person makes when they are hearing a true thing and know it and are not sure yet what to do with that knowledge. He said, "And now you're pulling it back up." Saoirse said, "We're trying." Mira said quieter, "It's also just it was her dad's, so." Saoirse looked at Mira with the expression of someone who had not expected that to be said out loud and had also not wanted it unsaid. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then William said, "Right," and it was exactly the right word, the only word, a word that acknowledged everything without performing acknowledgement, and Priya thought, "I am going to have to completely rethink this piece." The finished textile was in the showroom off the main floor, a space that had been fitted out with more care than the rest of the building, white walls and good lighting, and a long table on which bolts of fabric were arranged in a sequence that moved from darkest to lightest. Deep charcoal, slate blue, a gray so pale it was nearly white, almost luminous in the flat Cornish light. William picked up the edge of the charcoal fabric and held it between his fingers. He had the look of someone who had handled enough good cloth over a lifetime of formal occasions to know immediately when something was different. He moved it, held it up, set it down. "It's heavier than I expected," he said. "Most people say that," Mira said. "It's the nylon density. Ghost nets are built to last in open water under stress. That durability is the problem ecologically. It's also what makes the fiber so good." "What does it cost per meter?" Mira told him. It was a number that made one of the PRs near the door make a small, involuntary face. William nodded slowly. "Why isn't it cheaper?" Mira looked at him to check whether it was a genuine question. It was. She told him, "The recovery divers, the hand sorting, which could not yet be mechanized because the material variability was too great, the processing modifications, the fact that the Italian label they worked with had insisted on a minimum quality standard that required them to reject approximately 1/3 of incoming material as unsuitable, which meant they were absorbing the cost of recovering fiber they couldn't sell. The fact that scaling would require commercial fishing fleets to voluntarily participate in gear reporting and recovery, rather than paying fines to avoid it, and that voluntary participation at scale required either regulatory incentive or market incentive, and they were currently building the market incentive from scratch with no guarantee the regulatory side would follow. William listened to all of this, then he said, "So the price is the point." Mira went still. "It's not overpriced," he said. "It's priced correctly for what it actually costs to do this. And if it were cheaper, it would mean some of that cost was being externalized somewhere." "Yes," Mira said, "that's exactly it." He nodded. "Set the fabric down carefully, the way you set down something you want to pick up again." Saoirse was watching him with an expression Priya recognized from interviews with people who have been asked the same questions by 100 journalists and have given up expecting anyone to hear the actual answer. It was the expression of someone who had just, unexpectedly, been heard. Priya wrote, "He got it." Then she looked at what she'd written and didn't cross it out. The press pack was moved outside for photographs at 2:30. The light was doing something extraordinary with the old stone of the building, that particular late autumn Cornish trick, where the clouds part for 20 minutes and the whole coast goes gold. The photographers were very happy. The PRs were very happy. William stood between Saoirse and Mira, and several photos were taken, and he smiled in the way he had been smiling in photographs since he was 9 years old, which was a real smile, but also a practiced one. A smile he could produce reliably under conditions of flash and instruction. Priya stayed inside. She was standing near the door to the showroom, notebook open, reading back her notes. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. William had come back in, minus the handlers, with only one security officer who positioned himself near the door with the particular stillness of a man paid to be furniture. He walked to where Saoirse and Mira were standing near the long table, talking quietly about something that had nothing to do with the visit. They looked up. He said, "I wanted to ask you something without," he gestured vaguely at the door, by which he meant the cameras and the PRs and the entire choreography of the afternoon. "What do you actually need? Not for today, for this to work." Saoirse and Mira looked at each other. The look of two people who have discussed this exact question many times and have a real answer, and are deciding whether to give it to someone who probably can't action it. Mira said, "Not funding, we have a funding path. What we need is legitimacy. One government procurement contract. One public institution that buys this fabric for something. Anything, uniforms, furnishings, it doesn't matter. Something that means when we go to a fishing fleet in Norway or the Azores and ask them to participate in gear reporting, we can say, there is a market. The British government is in it. This is real." William said nothing for a moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a small notebook, not a phone, an actual paper notebook, the kind that looked like it had been used before, and wrote something in it. He didn't say what he was writing. He put the notebook away. "Thank you for today," he said, "both of you." He shook their hands again, the same handshake as before, firm, brief, no performance. Then he went back outside. Priya had not turned her recorder on. She looked down at her notebook, then at the door, then at Saoirse and Mira, who were looking at each other with the particular expression of people who have just had something happen to them that they are not yet sure what to call. Saoirse said, to no one in particular, "He wrote it down." Mira said, "He had a notebook." "An actual notebook." "I know." They were quiet for a moment. Then Mira laughed, a short, real laugh, the kind that comes out when something has caught you off guard in a direction you weren't expecting, and said, "Right, okay then." Priya filed from the car park at 3:20, sitting in the driver's seat of her rental with the engine off and the heater on, and her laptop open on the passenger seat. Her editor called at past. She let it ring twice, then answered. He said, "How was the greenwashing tour?" She said, "I can't write that one." A pause. "What do you mean you can't write it?" "I mean I went there to write it and I can't. There's no seam, I looked." Another pause, longer. Her editor had worked with her for 6 years and knew what it meant when she said there was no seam. It meant she had looked properly. "So what are you writing?" She looked out through the windscreen at the old building. The light had gone flat again, the gold finished, the stone back to its ordinary pale gray. A group of the other journalists were loading into a minibus. One of them was holding a bolt of the charcoal fabric, a sample presumably, and examining it in the car park light. She said, "There are 2 women in there whose fathers were fishermen. One of them left ghost gear behind because the system made it cheaper than not leaving it. His daughter spent 7 years building a business that pulls it back up. The textile they make from it is priced correctly for the actual cost of making it responsibly, which is why nobody can afford to scale it yet, which is why they need a government to put its name on it. And a prince came today and asked all the wrong questions, and heard every answer and wrote something in a notebook and didn't promise anything." Her editor was quiet. She said, "It's a story about what it costs to do something right, and about how rarely we build systems that make the right thing the affordable thing, and about 2 women who decided to build the system themselves from the outside." He said, "Is it a good story?" She thought about the net room, the cold, the smell of deep water, the ghost crab frozen mid-alarm, Saoirse's voice flat and factual saying, "My father's boat left gear behind." She said, "Yeah, it's a good story." She hung up and started writing. The piece she filed at 7 that evening was not the piece she had planned on the train. It had no irony in it, which was unusual for her. It did not use the words transformative or circular or experience, which the press release had used many times. It was not a takedown, and it was not a puff piece. It was a thing she wrote maybe twice a year, the kind of story that arrived when she had not been looking for it, when she had gone somewhere to find one thing and found something true instead. She wrote about ghost gear and the math that made abandonment rational and the regulatory failure that allowed silence to be cheaper than honesty. She wrote about Saoirse and Mira, not their origin story as a brand narrative but their actual origin, the fishing communities, the fathers, the specific weight of building something that was also an act of repair toward people who were already gone. She wrote about the fabric and what it cost, and why the cost was honest. She wrote about Bastard February because it was too good to leave out, and because it told you something true about the kind of people who named their machines. She wrote one paragraph about William. She did not speculate about what he had written in the notebook. She noted only that he had listened, actually listened, the way you could tell when someone was doing it, and that he had stayed behind when the cameras went outside, and that the question he had asked was the right one. She let the paragraph be short. The restraint felt accurate. She did not write about standing in the net room longer than she needed to. But she had stood there. After the tour moved on, she had gone back through the heavy doors alone for 3 minutes and stood in the cold and the mineral smell, and looked up at the tangled masses hanging from the ceiling. The hundreds of kilometers of nylon that had once been killing things in the dark at the bottom of the ocean, and were now waiting, in a cold room in Cornwall, to become something a person could wear. She had thought about what it meant to make something beautiful from the evidence of a mistake, not to erase the mistake, to hold it and transform it and make it useful, to pull it back up. She had stood there in the cold until she was sure she understood what she had seen. Then she went and wrote it down.